Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight we're travelling back to 1978, to a moment when the future of interactive entertainment changed forever, a moment when rows of pixelated aliens descended from the top of a screen and the world held its breath. This is the complete history of Space Invaders, the game that didn't just create an industry, it defined what a video game could be. If you enjoy these quiet explorations of computing history, I invite you to like and subscribe or share a simple thought down in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest, settle in, and let the story unfold. Let's begin. Space Invaders is more than a game. It's a cultural touchstone, a technical marvel, and a testament to how constraints can breed creativity. When Tomohiro Nishikado sat down to create this game in 1977, he couldn't have known that his creation would spark a global phenomenon. He couldn't have predicted that the simple act of shooting descending aliens would captivate millions, inspire countless imitators, and establish patterns that game designers still follow today. The game's premise is elegantly simple. You control a laser cannon at the bottom of the screen. Above you, 55 aliens march in formation, moving left to right, then down, then right to left, then down again in a hypnotic, inevitable descent. Your job is to shoot them before they reach the bottom. Your only protection is a set of destructible barriers that slowly erode under enemy fire. The aliens shoot back. You have 3 lives. The tension builds with every wave. But beneath this simplicity lies a world of innovation. Space Invaders pioneered concepts that we now take for granted. High-score tracking, increasing difficulty, and the idea that a game could be both a test of reflexes and a meditation on futility. Because no matter how skilled you become, the aliens always win eventually. The question is never if you'll lose, but how long you can hold out. This philosophical core, the struggle against inevitable defeat, resonated deeply in 1978, and it resonates still. The cultural impact cannot be overstated. In Japan, Space Invaders caused a temporary shortage of 100 yen coins as players fed machines with religious fervour. In America, it helped transform arcades from seedy hangouts into mainstream entertainment venues. The iconic alien sprites became symbols recognized worldwide, appearing on everything from t-shirts to gallery walls. The game's influence touched music, fashion, art, and even the way we think about human-computer interaction. Tonight, we'll explore every aspect of this groundbreaking game. We'll trace its origins in the mind of a determined engineer. We'll examine the technical wizardry that made it possible on primitive hardware. We'll follow its journey from Japanese arcades to global phenomenon. We'll dissect the bug that accidentally created dynamic difficulty. We'll uncover the programming secrets hidden in its assembly code, and we'll understand why, decades later, Space Invaders remains relevant, studied, celebrated, and played. This is not just the story of a game, it's the story of how a simple idea, executed with brilliance under severe constraints, can change the world. It's about the moment when video games stopped being novelties and became culture. So close your eyes if you wish, let your breathing slow, and drift with me into the glowing phosphor screens of 1978, where history was made one alien at a time. Before Space Invaders, there was a young engineer named Tomohiro Nishikado, working at Taito Corporation in Tokyo. Born in 1944, Nishikado had studied engineering and joined Taito in 1969, at a time when the company was transitioning from traditional mechanical amusement machines to electronic games. He was fascinated by the potential of microprocessors, those new silicon brains that could execute instructions at speeds mechanical systems never could. In the mid-1970s, arcade games were primitive affairs. Pong had demonstrated that simple electronic competitions could captivate players, but most games remained variations on ball and paddle mechanics. Nishikado wanted to create something different, something with more depth and narrative tension. He drew inspiration from several sources: war films he'd watched, science fiction novels he'd read, and a desire to create a shooting game that felt more interactive than the mechanical target games of the era. His initial concept was to create a game where players shot at human soldiers, but as he began prototyping, this felt uncomfortable, even disturbing. Shooting human targets, even pixelated ones, carried moral weight that would limit the game's appeal. He needed enemies that players could destroy without ethical qualms. His solution came from the science fiction he loved: aliens, invaders from space, marching in formation, threatening Earth. The metaphor was perfect: clear enemies, existential stakes, and no moral ambiguity. The development of Space Invaders took approximately 1 year, from 1977 to 1978, and it consumed Nishikado entirely. He worked alone on much of the design and programming, a common practice in the early days of game development when teams were small and roles overlapped. He designed the game mechanics, wrote the assembly code, created the graphics, and even composed the simple but effective sound effects. This singular vision would prove crucial to the game's coherence and impact. The aliens themselves went through several design iterations. Early versions featured military vehicles, tanks and aircraft, but these lacked personality. Nishikado experimented with different shapes until he arrived at the iconic designs we know today. 3 types of aliens, each with a distinctive silhouette: the octopus-like creature, the crab, and the squid. These designs were simple enough to render with limited graphics capabilities, but distinctive enough to be memorable. Each type carried a different point value, adding strategic depth to target selection. Creating the game required solving numerous technical challenges. The hardware available in 1977 was severely limited compared to modern standards. Memory was measured in kilobytes, processing power was measured in megahertz, and display technology was monochrome. Yet from these constraints emerged innovation. Nishikado had to develop custom hardware when existing arcade boards proved insufficient for his vision. He chose the Intel 8080 microprocessor, the same chip that powered some of the first personal computers, and built a system around it that could handle the game's demands. The development process was iterative and experimental. There were no established best practices for video game design in 1977. Every choice, how fast the aliens moved, how many barriers to include, how the scoring system worked, required testing and refinement. Nishikado would program a feature, test it himself, adjust the parameters, and test again. He sought feedback from colleagues at Taito, watching their reactions and noting what created tension, excitement, or frustration. One of his key insights was the importance of rhythm. The aliens didn't just move steadily across the screen, they pulsed to a 4-note bass line that increased in tempo as fewer aliens remained. This audio-visual synchronization created a sense of mounting urgency that was unprecedented in arcade games. The sound wasn't just decoration. It was integral to the gameplay experience, a heartbeat that quickened as danger intensified. Nishikado also understood the importance of player progression. Space Invaders introduced the concept of waves or levels, where defeating one formation of aliens would spawn a new formation that moved faster. This created a natural difficulty curve that kept players engaged. Early waves allowed players to learn the mechanics and build confidence. Later waves tested their mastery and reflexes. The game never became trivial, even for skilled players, because each wave introduced new challenges. The barrier system added another layer of strategic depth. The 4 destructible bunkers provided temporary cover, but they eroded under fire from both the aliens and the player's own shots. This created interesting tactical decisions. Should you hide behind the barriers and play defensively, or should you move into open space to get clearer shots? Should you preserve the barriers for late-game protection, or use them aggressively in early waves? These choices gave the game replayability beyond simple score chasing. By early 1978, Space Invaders was ready. Nishikado had created something unprecedented, a game that combined action, strategy, and escalating tension in a package that was immediately accessible but deeply engaging. Taito recognized the potential and prepared for release, though even they couldn't have predicted the phenomenon that was about to unfold. The stage was set for Space Invaders to invade the world. Understanding Space Invaders requires understanding the hardware it ran on, because the game's design was intimately shaped by technical limitations. In 1978, arcade machines were self-contained units that combined display, input, audio, and computing systems in a single cabinet. The Space Invaders arcade machine was a marvel of engineering, pushing contemporary hardware to its limits. At the heart of the system was the Intel 8080 microprocessor, running at 2 MHz. To put this in perspective, a modern smartphone processor runs at speeds thousands of times faster. The 8080 was an 8-bit chip, meaning it could process data 8 bits at a time. It could address up to 64 kilobytes of memory, though the actual Space Invaders machine used far less. This processor had to handle everything: game logic, graphics rendering, collision detection, input processing, and sound generation. The efficiency required was staggering. The display was a black and white CRT monitor, oriented vertically to create a tall playfield. The screen resolution was 224 pixels wide by 256 pixels tall, though the display was rotated 90 degrees in the cabinet, so players saw 256 pixels wide by 224 tall. This vertical orientation was unusual for the time, but perfect for the game's mechanics of aliens descending from above. The screen refresh rate was tied to the monitor's scan rate, typically 60 Hz, meaning the display updated 60 times per second. Graphics were generated by directly writing to video RAM, a section of memory that the display hardware continuously read to determine which pixels to illuminate. There was no graphics processor, no sprites, no hardware acceleration of any kind. Every pixel had to be calculated and written by the CPU. This meant that Nishikado had to be extraordinarily clever about how he rendered the aliens, the player's cannon, the bullets, and the barriers. He developed a technique of storing graphics as bitmaps, patterns of bits that represented the visual appearance of objects, and then copying these bitmaps to the appropriate locations in video memory. The game used 8 kilobytes of ROM, read-only memory, to store the program code and graphics data. This included all the assembly language instructions that define the game's behavior, plus the bitmap patterns for aliens, the player cannon, bullets, explosions, and the character set for displaying text and scores. 8 kilobytes is approximately the size of a small text document by modern standards. Into this space, Nishikado packed an entire game. Work RAM, random access memory, used for storing variables and game state during play, was even more limited, just 1 kilobyte. This single kilobyte had to track the position and status of all 55 aliens, the player's position and lives, the state of every bullet on screen, the condition of the 4 barriers, which degraded pixel by pixel, the current score, and all the temporary variables needed for calculations. Modern games often use gigabytes of RAM. Space Invaders used 1,000 bytes. Sound was generated through simple analog circuits, not digital audio samples. The game had no sound chip. Instead, it used the CPU to toggle output lines at specific frequencies, creating tones. The iconic 4-note bass line was produced by cycling through 4 different frequencies at specific intervals. The shooting sounds, explosion effects, and UFO hum were all created through similar techniques, the CPU toggling pins on and off at carefully chosen rates. This created a distinctive, minimalist soundscape that was both technically efficient and artistically effective. Input was straightforward. 2 buttons for moving left and right, 1 button for fire. These were connected directly to input ports that the CPU could read. The simplicity of the control scheme was intentional. Anyone could understand how to play within seconds. But the input handling code had to be responsive, reading the button states multiple times per frame to ensure that player commands were never missed. The precision of the controls was crucial to the game's playability. The machine also included coin mechanisms and circuitry to track credits. When a player inserted a coin, it triggered an interrupt that the CPU would handle, incrementing the credit counter displayed on screen. This economic infrastructure turned the game into a money-making machine for arcade operators, and it meant that every design decision had to balance challenge with accessibility, difficult enough to limit playtime per credit, but fair enough to keep players coming back. One of the most remarkable aspects of the hardware design was the use of colored overlays. The game itself rendered in black and white, but Taito placed colored cellophane strips over different sections of the screen. The top portion, where the UFO appeared, was covered with red. The alien formation area was green. The bottom area, where the player moved, was white. This created the illusion of color graphics without requiring color display hardware, which would have been prohibitively expensive and complex in 1978. It was a brilliant hack that enhanced visual interest with minimal cost. The cabinet itself was designed for maximum visibility in arcades. The control panel was at a comfortable height, angled for extended play. The screen was bright and clearly visible even in ambient arcade lighting. The artwork on the cabinet exterior, painted aliens and dramatic space scenes, caught the eye of potential players walking past. Every element of the physical design supported the commercial goal: get players to approach, insert coins, and play. The technical architecture of Space Invaders was a masterclass in doing more with less. Nishikado worked within severe constraints, but rather than seeing these as limitations, he used them as creative prompts. The monochrome display meant that enemies had to be visually distinct through shape rather than color. The limited memory meant that every byte had to justify its existence. The slow processor meant that algorithms had to be ruthlessly efficient. From these pressures emerged a game that felt fast, responsive, and polished despite the primitive technology beneath. Space Invaders established many conventions that would become standard in video game design, but at the time of its creation, these were novel solutions to unprecedented problems. How do you create compelling gameplay from simple mechanics? How do you maintain player interest over multiple sessions? How do you balance challenge and accessibility? Nishikado's answers to these questions would influence game designers for decades. The core gameplay loop is elegantly simple. Aliens march across the screen in formation. They move left until they reach the edge, then drop down one row and reverse direction. They continue this pattern, descending toward the player with each cycle. The player moves horizontally along the bottom of the screen, shooting upward at the aliens. Each alien destroyed increases the player's score. If an alien reaches the bottom of the screen, the game ends. If an alien bullet hits the player, one life is lost. Clear all aliens to advance to the next wave. This basic structure creates natural dramatic tension. Early in each wave, when all 55 aliens are present, the formation moves relatively slowly, giving players time to aim carefully and develop strategy. As aliens are destroyed, the formation moves faster because fewer aliens need to be processed per frame, a consequence of the hardware limitations that accidentally created dynamic difficulty. The result is a gradual acceleration that builds pressure throughout each wave. The alien formation consists of 5 rows of 11 aliens each. The bottom row contains 2 rows of the octopus-type alien, worth 10 points each. The middle 2 rows contain the crab-type alien, worth 20 points each. The top row contains the squid-type alien, worth 30 points each. This scoring structure creates interesting strategic choices. Should you target the higher value aliens at the top first, maximizing points per shot but allowing the formation to descend more quickly? Or should you thin the bottom rows first, slowing the formation's descent but earning fewer points? Different players develop different strategies based on their goals, survival versus high score. The barriers add another dimension to the strategy. There are 4 bunkers positioned between the player and the aliens, providing temporary cover. Each bunker starts as a solid shape, but erodes pixel by pixel when struck by bullets, either alien fire or the player's own shots. This erosion is not random. It follows a specific pattern of damage based on where each bullet impacts. A bullet hitting the center of a bunker will remove a circular pattern of pixels. Successive hits will carve larger and larger holes until the bunker is reduced to scattered fragments. The barrier degradation creates evolving tactical situations. Early in the game, intact bunkers provide reliable cover. Players can peek out to fire, then duck behind protection. But as the bunkers erode, they become less effective. Players must adapt their positioning, perhaps moving to less damaged bunkers or accepting greater exposure to maintain their firing angles. Late in a wave, when bunkers are nearly destroyed and aliens are moving quickly, the game becomes a test of reflexes and nerve. Player movement is continuous. Holding left or right moves the cannon smoothly across the screen. But firing has a critical limitation. Only one player bullet can be on screen at a time. You cannot fire again until your previous shot either hits something or travels off the top of the screen. This creates a rhythm to shooting. Fire, watch, fire, watch, and punishes wild spraying. Accurate shooting is rewarded not just with points, but with the ability to fire more frequently. Alien bullets are more numerous but follow specific patterns. Each alien formation can have up to 3 bullets on screen simultaneously. The bullets don't fire randomly. They're controlled by logic that targets areas near the player. The specific algorithms create streams of fire that players learn to anticipate and dodge. The bullets also move at a speed that's challenging but fair, fast enough to be threatening but slow enough that attentive players can weave between them. The UFO adds an element of bonus scoring. Periodically, a flying saucer crosses the top of the screen, accompanied by a distinctive warbling sound. Shooting the UFO awards bonus points, but the point value is not random. It's determined by the number of shots the player has fired in the current wave. Based on what we know, we can infer that the code tracks shot count and uses it to select from a set of possible scores ranging from 50 to 300 points. This creates a hidden scoring system that expert players learn to manipulate, firing specific numbers of shots before targeting the UFO to guarantee maximum points. Death and respawn mechanics are simple but effective. When hit, the player's cannon explodes in a brief animation. The game pauses for a moment, Then a new cannon appears at the center bottom of the screen. The aliens continue their pattern undisturbed. This means that dying has real consequences. You lose whatever positional advantage you had, and the aliens gain that many more cycles of advancement. With only 3 lives per game, each death is significant. Wave progression increases the challenge in multiple ways. New waves start with aliens positioned slightly lower on the screen, reducing the time players have to clear them. The aliens also start moving faster with each successive wave, though this could be an implementation detail of how the game initializes alien speed, rather than explicit difficulty scaling. The barriers do not regenerate between waves, so damage from previous waves persists, gradually degrading the player's defensive options over the course of a full game. There is no victory condition in Space Invaders, no final wave or ending screen. The game continues indefinitely, with each wave harder than the last, until the player exhausts all lives. This structure, unusual by modern standards, was common in early arcade games, which were designed to extract maximum playtime from each credit. The goal shifts from win the game to achieve the highest score possible, or survive as many waves as possible. This endless structure makes Space Invaders a test of endurance and mastery, rather than a narrative experience with a conclusion. The high score system was revolutionary. Prior arcade games rarely tracked scores across sessions. Space Invaders displayed the current high score prominently at the top of the screen, and if you achieved a new record, your score would persist after you walked away, challenging the next player. This simple feature created competition between strangers, turning the game into an asynchronous multiplayer experience. Players would return to arcades specifically to reclaim their high score from whoever had surpassed them. The game's pacing demonstrates sophisticated understanding of player psychology. The opening seconds of each wave provide a grace period. Aliens are slow, barriers are fresh, and players can establish their rhythm. As the wave progresses, pressure builds naturally through the acceleration effect. By the final few aliens, heart rates spike as the formation screams across the screen. Then, for a brief moment after clearing the wave, there's relief before the next formation appears and the cycle begins again. This rhythm of tension and release keeps players engaged and creates memorable moments of narrow survival. One of Space Invaders' most celebrated features, the way the aliens speed up as you destroy them, was not intentionally designed. It was a consequence of hardware limitations that Nishikado recognized and embraced. This happy accident demonstrates how constraints can sometimes produce superior results than unlimited resources, and it's become one of the most famous examples of emergent gameplay in video game history. The Intel 8080 processor running Space Invaders had to handle all game logic within the constraints of each display frame. At 60 frames per second, the processor had approximately 16.7 milliseconds to complete all calculations before the next frame began. During each frame, the code had to update the position of every alien, check for collisions, update bullets, handle player input, draw graphics to video memory, and manage sound. The more objects on screen, the more processing time required. When a wave begins with all 55 aliens present, updating their positions consumed a significant portion of the available processing time. The main game loop would iterate through each alien, calculate its new position based on the formation's current direction and speed, check if it needed to drop down and reverse direction, and update its location in memory. With 55 aliens to process, this took long enough that the overall game update rate was constrained. The aliens moved at a certain speed, not because Nishikado programmed them to move that slowly, but because the hardware couldn't process them any faster. As players destroyed aliens, fewer objects required processing. Destroying 10 aliens meant the game loop had to update only 45 positions instead of 55. This freed up processing time within each frame. With more available time, the game could run more iterations of its main loop per second, which meant the aliens updated their positions more frequently, which made them appear to move faster. The effect was gradual at first. Destroying a few aliens in the top rows created barely noticeable acceleration. But as more aliens fell, the speed-up became dramatic. By the time only a handful of aliens remained, the formation would race across the screen at speeds far exceeding the initial crawl. This created nail-biting endgame scenarios where players had to react almost instantaneously to destroy the final fast-moving invaders before they descended to the bottom. The last alien on screen would zip back and forth with blinding speed, demanding absolute precision and concentration to hit. Nishikado could have implemented frame rate limiting to keep the aliens moving at a constant speed regardless of how many were on screen. This would have been the correct engineering solution, ensuring consistent behavior across all game states. But when he observed the acceleration effect during testing, he recognized its value. The gradual speed-up created natural difficulty progression within each wave. It rewarded players for their success. Each alien destroyed was progress, while simultaneously raising the stakes. It transformed what could have been a monotonous shooting gallery into an increasingly intense challenge. The speed increase also had psychological benefits. It provided immediate feedback that your actions were having an effect. Destroying aliens wasn't just about points, it visibly altered the game's pace. This created a sense of cause and effect that strengthened the connection between player and game. It also introduced risk-reward calculations. Focusing fire on top-row aliens, worth more points, would leave more lower aliens intact longer, keeping the formation slower. Clearing the bottom rows first would speed up the remaining aliens, but ensure they had farther to descend. From a technical perspective, the effect occurred because the game's timing was tied to its processing load, rather than to an external clock. Modern game engines use delta time, measuring the actual elapsed time between frames and adjusting movement accordingly to ensure consistent behavior regardless of frame rate. But Space Invaders simply executed its main loop as fast as the hardware allowed. Each iteration moved aliens by a fixed number of pixels, so more iterations per second meant more pixels of movement per second. This technique, while unintentional, demonstrated an important principle. Perceived difficulty can be more important than absolute difficulty. The acceleration made waves feel dramatically harder, even though the actual challenge, hitting targets with your shots, remained fundamentally the same. The psychological pressure of faster-moving targets created tension that a constant speed game would have lacked. Players reported their hearts racing as the final alien zipped across the screen, even though, objectively, hitting a fast-moving target in one position is no harder than hitting a slow-moving target in the same position. The Buggers feature story of Space Invaders acceleration has been told and retold in game development circles as a parable about embracing accidents. It reminds developers to test their prototypes with an open mind, watching for emergent behaviors that might improve the experience. Many intentional design decisions are less elegant than the unintended consequences of simple systems interacting. Space Invaders' fame owes much to Nishikado's wisdom in recognizing the value of this hardware-induced speed-up and preserving it in the final game. Interestingly, this effect would become more pronounced as players improved. Skilled players who could quickly thin the alien ranks would experience more dramatic acceleration, creating a form of adaptive difficulty. Struggling players who let the full formation descend would face the aliens at slower speeds for longer, giving them more time to react. The game naturally calibrated its challenge to player skill, all through an emergent property of limited processing power. The speed-up effect became so iconic that when Space Invaders was ported to more powerful hardware, developers had to intentionally recreate the acceleration through artificial frame rate limiting. On systems fast enough to process all 55 aliens without slowdown, the game would have felt flat and too easy. Preserving the difficulty curve required deliberately throttling performance, simulating the limitations of the original hardware. This is perhaps the ultimate testament to the value of the bug. Future developers spent effort to recreate it because its absence made the game worse. When Space Invaders launched in Japan in the summer of 1978, Taito had modest expectations. Arcade games were profitable but niche, typically installed in specialized game centers and bars. The company printed several hundred cabinets for the initial rollout, planning to gauge reception before committing to larger production. What happened instead was unprecedented, a cultural phenomenon that would change Japanese entertainment forever. The game appeared in Tokyo arcades first, and word spread quickly. Within days, lines formed outside establishments that had installed the new machines. Players discovered that Space Invaders offered something previous arcade games lacked: depth. While Pong and its descendants could be mastered in minutes, Space Invaders revealed new challenges with each wave. The high score system created competition between strangers. The escalating difficulty meant that improving your score required genuine skill development, not just luck or twitch reflexes. Japanese players embraced the game with intensity that surprised even Taito. Arcades that installed Space Invaders saw immediate returns, with machines operating constantly from morning to late night. The distinctive sound of the 4-note bass line became audible from blocks away, drawing curious passers-by. Coffee shops and restaurants installed cabinets to attract customers. Department stores added Space Invaders machines to their game floors. Within months, it seemed impossible to walk through any commercial district in Tokyo without encountering the game. The demand quickly outstripped supply. Taito ramped up production, but arcade operators desperate for machines resorted to buying from grey market sources or even constructing unauthorized clones. The company eventually produced approximately 100,000 Space Invaders cabinets for the Japanese market alone, an astonishing number for any arcade game, but particularly for one released in the late 1970s when the video game industry was still nascent. The most famous story about Space Invaders' Japanese launch concerns a supposed shortage of 100 yen coins. According to popular legend, so many coins were being fed into Space Invaders machines that Japan's 100 yen coin supply was depleted, forcing the government to mint additional currency. This story has been repeated in countless articles, documentaries, and books over the decades. However, based on what we know, we can infer that this tale is likely exaggerated or apocryphal. While Space Invaders certainly consumed enormous quantities of 100 yen coins, there's little documented evidence of an actual national shortage requiring government intervention. That said, the legend's persistence speaks to a deeper truth. Space Invaders genuinely did create localized coin circulation patterns. In neighborhoods with dense concentrations of game centers, arcade operators reported difficulty obtaining sufficient coins for change-making. Banks near popular arcades noticed unusual withdrawal patterns. Some businesses found themselves short on 100 yen pieces because customers were converting their change into arcade tokens. While not a national crisis, the game's economic impact was real and noticeable at the street level. The social impact extended beyond economics. Space Invaders attracted a broader demographic than previous arcade games. While earlier games appealed primarily to children and young men, Space Invaders drew players across age and gender lines. Salarymen in business suits would stop at arcades on their way home from work. Students would skip classes to play. Women, traditionally not targeted by arcade marketing, became regular players. The game's simple controls and gradual difficulty curve made it accessible to novices, while its depth kept experienced players engaged. This demographic expansion had lasting effects on Japanese gaming culture. Arcades evolved from marginal entertainment venues into mainstream gathering places. Game centers diversified their offerings, adding more sophisticated titles to capitalize on the audience Space Invaders had attracted. The success demonstrated that video games could be more than children's toys. They could be serious entertainment for adults, social spaces for communities, and legitimate business opportunities. Media coverage amplified the phenomenon. Newspapers ran features on the Space Invaders craze. Television programs showed footage of packed arcades. Magazines published strategy guides and high-score listings. This coverage created a feedback loop. Media attention drew more players, which generated more media interest, which brought even more players. Space Invaders became a topic of conversation in schools, workplaces, and homes. Not playing the game meant being left out of a shared cultural experience. The game also inspired competitive play. While formal tournaments wouldn't emerge until later, informal competitions arose organically. Arcades would post high-score lists, and players would return repeatedly to claim the top spot. Some establishments offered prizes, free plays, merchandise, or prestige for achieving new records. These competitions created local celebrities, players known for their exceptional skill, whose techniques would be studied and emulated by others. The social dynamics around competitive play would later inform the development of esports, though that term wouldn't be coined for decades. Taito's financial success was immense. The company's stock price surged. Revenue from Space Invaders dwarfed all previous arcade releases. The game single-handedly transformed Taito from a mid-tier amusement company into an industry leader. This success attracted attention from competitors, both domestic and international, who rushed to develop their own space-themed shooters or to license Space Invaders for their markets. Educational institutions and psychologists began studying the Space Invaders phenomenon. Researchers investigated what made the game so compelling, analyzing its reward structures, difficulty curves, and social elements. Some expressed concern about potential addiction, particularly among young people spending excessive amounts of money and time in arcades. These debates foreshadowed larger conversations about video game effects that would recur throughout gaming history. By the end of 1978, Space Invaders had become more than a game. It was a social phenomenon. The term Space Invaders game centers entered the Japanese lexicon to describe dedicated arcades. The alien sprites appeared in advertisements, on clothing, and in art. Musicians incorporated the game's sounds into their compositions. The game had transcended entertainment to become a cultural touchstone, a shared reference point for an entire generation of Japanese youth. The success in Japan set the stage for international expansion. Taito began exploring licensing agreements with foreign distributors, recognizing that Space Invaders' appeal might translate across cultures. The game's simplicity, no language barriers, intuitive controls, universal themes of defense and survival, made it an ideal candidate for global distribution. What had begun as one engineer's vision in a Tokyo office was about to become a worldwide phenomenon. While Space Invaders dominated Japanese arcades in 1978, the game's arrival in the United States would prove even more transformative. The American arcade industry in the late 1970s was fragmented, with numerous regional distributors and operators. Taito needed a partner with nationwide reach to maximize the game's potential. They found that partner in Midway Manufacturing, a Chicago-based arcade company that had successfully distributed other Japanese games in the American market. The licensing agreement between Taito and Midway, signed in 1978, granted Midway the rights to manufacture and distribute Space Invaders cabinets in the United States. Midway would pay Taito a licensing fee for each unit produced, while handling all manufacturing, marketing, and distribution domestically. This arrangement allowed Taito to enter the American market without establishing its own manufacturing and distribution infrastructure, while giving Midway access to a proven hit. Midway's first Space Invaders cabinets arrived in American arcades in late 1978 and early 1979. The reception was immediate and overwhelming. Like in Japan, lines formed outside arcades. Players discovered that this Japanese import offered something most American arcade games lacked: sustained challenge and competitive depth. The high-score chase became addictive. The escalating difficulty kept games tense from start to finish. The simple controls meant anyone could play, but mastery took dedication. American arcades in the late 1970s were still recovering from a post-Pong slump. After the initial pinball boom and the brief Pong craze, many arcades struggled to attract customers with mechanical games and derivative ball and paddle titles. Space Invaders revitalized the industry overnight. Arcade operators who'd been considering closing their doors suddenly found themselves profitable again. Establishments that installed multiple Space Invaders cabinets saw returns that exceeded their best pinball machines. The game's success sparked an arcade building boom. Entrepreneurs opened dedicated game centers in shopping malls, strip malls, and commercial districts. Existing businesses, bowling alleys, movie theaters, convenience stores, added arcade sections to capture Space Invaders traffic. By 1980, it was estimated that over 300,000 Space Invaders cabinets were operating in the United States, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in quarterly revenue. The game had become one of the most profitable entertainment products in American history. Space Invaders also changed American perceptions of video games. Prior to its arrival, video games were often viewed as novelty items, brief distractions for children. Space Invaders demonstrated that games could be serious entertainment for teenagers and adults. Media coverage shifted from dismissive to fascinated. Major newspapers and magazines ran features examining the Space Invaders phenomenon. Television programs showed footage of dedicated players achieving astronomical scores. The game entered mainstream consciousness in a way no previous video game had. This mainstream acceptance had demographic effects. American women began playing arcade games in larger numbers, drawn by Space Invaders' accessibility and non-violent theme. Despite the shooting, the aliens were clearly non-human, making the violence abstract and harmless. Older players, who might have felt uncomfortable in arcades oriented toward teenage boys, found Space Invaders welcoming. The game created a more diverse arcade culture, which would influence game design and marketing for years to come. The competitive scene in America developed differently than in Japan. American players embraced score chasing with fervor, developing and sharing strategies through word of mouth, and, increasingly, through nascent gaming magazines. Publications like Electronic Games and Video Games began printing strategy guides and high-score listings. Some arcades hosted tournaments with cash prizes or trophies. Regional champions emerged, and their techniques, Optimal firing patterns, barrier usage strategies, UFO timing spread through player communities. The American success attracted intense competition. Dozens of companies released Space Invaders clones with slight variations in graphics or mechanics, attempting to capture some of the market. Legal battles erupted as Taito and Midway pursued copyright infringement cases against the most blatant imitators. These legal fights would help establish intellectual property precedents for video game graphics and gameplay, though the court's understanding of video games as creative works was still developing. The most significant expansion beyond arcade cabinets came with home console ports. Atari, the dominant force in home video gaming through its VCS, later known as the Atari 2600 console, recognized that Space Invaders could drive hardware sales. In 1980, Atari secured licensing rights from Taito to create a home version of Space Invaders for the VCS. This decision would prove momentous for both companies and for the video game industry as a whole. The Atari 2600 version of Space Invaders, released in 1980, was the first officially licensed arcade game adapted for home consoles. Previous home console games had been original titles or loosely inspired by arcade hits, but Space Invaders brought the actual brand and gameplay from arcade to living room. Atari marketed the cartridge heavily, emphasizing that players could now experience the arcade phenomenon at home without feeding quarters into a machine. The cartridge's impact exceeded even Atari's optimistic projections. Space Invaders for the VCS sold over 2 million copies in its first year, making it the best-selling video game of 1980 by a wide margin. More significantly, many customers bought Atari 2600 consoles specifically to play Space Invaders at home. The game became the first killer app for a home console, a single title compelling enough to drive hardware purchases. Console sales quadrupled in the year following Space Invaders' release, firmly establishing the Atari 2600 as the dominant home gaming platform. The VCS version was not a perfect replica of the arcade original. The Atari 2600's hardware was less powerful than dedicated arcade boards, forcing compromises. The graphics were simpler, with blockier sprites and less detailed animation. The sound was more basic, limited by the VCS's simple audio chip. Only a single row of aliens appeared at a time rather than the full formation, cycling through the different types. There were fewer barriers, and their degradation was less sophisticated. Despite these limitations, the core gameplay remained intact. Shoot the aliens, avoid their fire, destroy them all before they reach the bottom. Importantly, the home version added features the arcade original lacked. It included multiple game variations, different alien speeds, different barrier configurations, options for 1 or 2 players taking turns. These variations extended replayability and made the game more accessible to different skill levels. Beginners could practice on slower modes before attempting the challenging versions that approximated arcade difficulty. Advanced players could tackle the fastest settings for ultimate tests of skill. The success of Space Invaders on the Atari 2600 established a business model that would define the video game industry for decades. Popular arcade games could be ported to home consoles, generating additional revenue and expanding the game's audience. This model encouraged arcade developers to think about potential home versions during design, considering which games would translate well to less powerful hardware. It also incentivized console manufacturers to secure exclusive licenses for popular arcade titles, creating competitive advantage in the hardware market. By 1982, Space Invaders had appeared on virtually every gaming platform available. Beyond the arcade original and Atari 2600 version, it was ported to competing consoles, home computers, and handheld devices. Each version adapted the core gameplay to its platform's capabilities and audience. The game's simple but compelling mechanics proved remarkably portable, able to deliver satisfying experiences across wildly different hardware specifications. The success of Space Invaders spawned an entire ecosystem of clones, variations, and inspired titles that would shape the early video game industry. Understanding this proliferation requires examining both the legal landscape of the late 1970s and the technical accessibility of replicating the game's core mechanics. Space Invaders existed at a unique moment when intellectual property protection for video games was poorly defined, and the barriers to entry for creating arcade games were relatively low. Within months of the original's release, unauthorized clones began appearing in arcades worldwide. These knockoffs had names like Space Attack, Space Stranger, Space Wars, Galaxy Invaders, and dozens more. Some were barely disguised copies, using nearly identical graphics and gameplay with only superficial changes to avoid obvious trademark infringement. Others introduced variations, different alien designs, additional weapons, changed scoring systems, while preserving the fundamental defend against descending enemies structure that made Space Invaders compelling. The technical process of creating a clone was straightforward for engineers familiar with arcade hardware. Space Invaders' mechanics were publicly visible. Anyone could play the game and observe how it functioned. The Intel 8080 processor and associated components were commercially available. An experienced programmer could recreate the core gameplay loop, collision detection, and scoring system and assembly language within weeks. Graphics could be redrawn to be legally distinct while functionally similar. The result would be a game that played nearly identically to Space Invaders, but avoided direct copying of code or assets. Taito and Midway pursued legal action against the most prominent clone manufacturers, but enforcement was challenging. Copyright protection for video game elements was untested in courts. Could gameplay mechanics be copyrighted, or only specific code and graphics? If someone created a game with functionally identical gameplay but original code and modified graphics, was that infringement or inspiration? These questions would take years to resolve through litigation, and in the meantime clones proliferated. Some variations were officially licensed by Taito or created by the company itself. Space Invaders Part 2, released in 1979, introduced new features while maintaining the core gameplay. This sequel added level variety with different alien formations, reinforcement aliens that would occasionally fly down to rejoin the formation, and more elaborate bonus stages. The graphics were slightly improved, and the sound effects were more varied. Part 2 was successful in Japan but had less impact internationally, where the original still dominated. Color versions of Space Invaders appeared as color monitor technology became more affordable. These versions replaced the black and white display with a true color screen, rendering aliens, bullets, and the player's cannon in multiple colors. Some color versions used different colors for each alien type, making them easier to distinguish. Others added colored backgrounds or animated effects. While these color versions were technically superior to the original monochrome game with cellophane overlays, many players felt they lost some of the stark, minimalist aesthetic that made the original so striking. Cocktail table versions adapted the game for sit-down play. These cabinets featured a horizontal screen embedded in a table surface, with controls on opposite sides allowing two players to take turns. The display would rotate 180 degrees between turns, so each player faced the screen right side up. Cocktail versions were popular in bars and restaurants, where they could serve as both entertainment and furniture. The social nature of taking turns at a shared table created different dynamics than standing side by side at an upright cabinet. Home computer versions brought Space Invaders to platforms like the Apple II, Commodore PET, TRS-80, and later machines. These versions varied widely in quality depending on the hardware capabilities and whether they were officially licensed. Some were faithful recreations that took advantage of the computer's superior processing power to add features. Others were bare-bones clones that barely captured the spirit of the original. The ability to play Space Invaders on a home computer, even a compromised version, appealed to early computing enthusiasts and helped legitimize computers as gaming devices. The influence of Space Invaders extended far beyond direct clones. The game established patterns that countless subsequent titles would follow. The concept of waves, or levels that increase in difficulty, became standard. The idea of a high score as the primary measure of achievement dominated arcade design throughout the early 1980s. The defend the bottom of the screen format spawned entire subgenres. Games like Galaxian, Galaga, Centipede, and many others built upon the foundation Space Invaders established, adding their own innovations while preserving the core appeal of action-oriented, score-driven gameplay. Interestingly, the variations and clones served an important function in spreading the Space Invaders phenomenon. In regions where official Taito or Midway cabinets were unavailable or too expensive, clones filled the demand. Players in small towns or developing countries might experience Space Invaders through an unauthorized copy, but the core experience still reached them. This grey market distribution, while economically harmful to Taito, helped establish Space Invaders as a global cultural touchstone rather than a product limited to wealthy markets. By the mid-1980s, Space Invaders had been ported to virtually every gaming platform in existence. The Nintendo Entertainment System featured Space Invaders. The Sega Master System had a version. Handheld devices from companies like Bandai and Tiger Electronics offered portable Space Invaders experiences. Even electronic calculators and digital watches featured tiny Space Invaders games. The mechanics were simple enough, and the gameplay compelling enough, that the game could scale down to incredibly limited hardware while remaining enjoyable. The ease of porting also made Space Invaders a common choice for programming tutorials and educational projects. Students learning assembly language or game development would often create a Space Invaders clone as a learning exercise. The game's systems, sprite rendering, collision detection, game state management, input handling, covered fundamental programming concepts without requiring advanced techniques. Countless programmers cut their teeth on Space Invaders implementations, learning the basics of game development through recreation of this influential title. Modern platforms have continued the tradition of Space Invaders ports and remakes. The game has appeared on smartphones, tablets, web browsers, and contemporary consoles. Some versions are faithful emulations of the original arcade game, allowing new generations to experience the classic unchanged. Others are reimaginings that update graphics, add new mechanics, or incorporate modern game design conventions while preserving the spirit of the original. Games like Space Invaders, Extreme, and Space Invaders Infinity Gene demonstrate that the core concept remains flexible enough to support creative reinterpretation decades after its creation. The proliferation of Space Invaders across platforms and in various forms speaks to the strength of its fundamental design. The game's mechanics are not tied to specific hardware or graphics fidelity. The core loop of shooting descending enemies works equally well in monochrome pixels or modern 3D graphics, on a flickering CRT or a high-definition display, with dedicated arcade controls or a touchscreen. This portability and adaptability have allowed Space Invaders to remain relevant and playable across technological generations, Space Invaders transcended its origins as a video game to become a cultural phenomenon whose influence extended into music, fashion, art, language, and social behaviour. The game's iconic imagery and sounds became shorthand for the emerging digital age, recognised by people who had never played it. Understanding the full cultural impact of Space Invaders requires looking beyond the arcade and examining how it permeated popular culture in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The visual design of the aliens became one of the most recognisable symbols of the digital revolution. The pixelated sprites, particularly the squid-like top-row alien, appeared on t-shirts, posters, album covers, and graffiti. Artists appreciated the minimalist geometric aesthetic that somehow conveyed character and menace despite being composed of barely a dozen pixels. The designs were simple enough to reproduce easily, whether stenciled on a wall or embroidered on fabric, but distinctive enough to be immediately identifiable. Musicians incorporated Space Invaders into their work. The game's 4-note bass line appeared in songs across genres, sampled or recreated on synthesizers. Electronic and new wave artists particularly embraced video game sounds as emblematic of technology in the future. Bands like Yellow Magic Orchestra and Kraftwerk included video game references in their performances and recordings. The distinctive sound effects, the ascending pitch of the alien's march, the explosion sounds, the UFO warble, became part of the sonic vocabulary of early electronic music. The game influenced visual artists working in various media. Pop artists created paintings and sculptures inspired by or directly depicting Space Invaders imagery. Street artists used the alien sprites in murals and installations, often as commentary on technology, invasion, or cultural homogeneity. The geometric grid-based layout of the game appealed to artists interested in pattern and repetition. The simplicity of the forms allowed for endless reinterpretation while maintaining recognizability. Fashion designers embraced Space Invaders motifs in clothing and accessories. T-shirts featuring the alien sprites became popular casual wear, particularly among young people and those identifying with emerging computer culture. The designs appeared on hats, bags, shoes, and jewellery. High-fashion designers occasionally referenced video game aesthetics in runway shows, using pixelated patterns or direct Space Invaders imagery. The game became a symbol of youth culture and technological fluency. Wearing Space Invaders merchandise signalled membership in a generation growing up with digital technology. The language surrounding Space Invaders entered everyday conversation. The term invaders became shorthand for the game itself. People didn't say, play Space Invaders, they said, play invaders. The phrase game over, while not originated by Space Invaders, became more widely used in everyday speech to signify the end of an attempt or opportunity. References to high scores, extra lives, and power-ups entered conversational vocabulary, often used metaphorically to describe real-world situations. Educational institutions began studying Space Invaders as a cultural and psychological phenomenon. Researchers examined why the game was so compelling, analysing its reward structures, difficulty curves, and social dynamics. Psychologists investigated the effects of extended gameplay on reflexes, attention, and problem-solving skills. Sociologists studied the arcade culture that formed around the game, examining how shared spaces devoted to video gaming influence social interaction and community formation. These academic investigations helped legitimize video games as worthy of serious study. The game appeared frequently in film and television as a visual shorthand for arcades or youth culture. Background shots of arcades would prominently feature Space Invaders cabinets. Characters in movies might be shown playing the game, often as character development suggesting they were tech-savvy or part of youth culture. Documentaries about the late 1970s and early 1980s invariably included footage of Space Invaders to evoke the era. The game became inseparable from the period's cultural identity. Museums began acquiring Space Invaders cabinets for their collections, recognizing the game's historical significance. The Museum of Modern Art in New York added Space Invaders to its design and architecture collection, acknowledging video games as a legitimate art form worthy of preservation. The Smithsonian Institution included Space Invaders in exhibitions on American culture and technological innovation. These institutional recognitions validated what players had always known, that video games could be culturally significant and worthy of study and preservation. The game influenced architecture and interior design in subtle ways. The grid-based layout and geometric forms of Space Invaders reflected and reinforced aesthetic trends in late 1970s design. The stark black backgrounds and bright foregrounds of the game's visuals aligned with minimalist design principles gaining popularity in the period. Designers working on spaces for young audiences, clubs, youth centers, technology-focused venues, sometimes incorporated Space Invaders imagery or similar geometric, grid-based patterns into their work. Advertising agencies recognized the power of Space Invaders imagery to capture attention and signal modernity. Advertisements for technology products, youth-oriented goods, and even unrelated products sometimes included Space Invaders references to appear contemporary and relevant. The aliens became visual shorthand for technology, or the future, in the same way that rockets and ray guns had signified science fiction in earlier decades. Marketers understood that Space Invaders had penetrated youth consciousness so thoroughly that its imagery carried instant recognition and positive associations. The social impact extended to changing perceptions of gaming and gamers. Before Space Invaders, video game players were often stereotyped as children or socially awkward young men. The game's broad appeal across demographics helped break down these stereotypes. Seeing business people, women, older adults, and families playing Space Invaders in public spaces normalized gaming as a mainstream leisure activity. This normalization would have long-term effects on the gaming industry, encouraging developers to create games for broader audiences and helping video games gain acceptance as legitimate entertainment. The competitive aspects of Space Invaders influenced the development of gaming communities and competitive play. Players who achieved high scores gained local fame and respect. Arcades became gathering places where enthusiasts would share strategies, watch skilled players perform, and form friendships based on shared interest. These informal communities were precursors to more organized gaming communities that would emerge with online connectivity. The social dynamics of gathering around screens, sharing knowledge, and celebrating skill would persist through gaming history. Space Invaders also influenced broader attitudes toward technology. The game demonstrated that computers could be entertaining, not just utilitarian tools for business or research. It suggested that human-computer interaction could be intuitive and rewarding. For many people, Space Invaders was their first extended interaction with computer technology, and the positive experience shaped their attitudes toward the coming digital revolution. The game made technology feel accessible and fun rather than intimidating and cold. To truly appreciate Space Invaders' technical achievement, we must examine the assembly language code that brought the game to life. Writing games in assembly language for the Intel 8080 processor required deep understanding of hardware architecture careful memory management, and clever optimization techniques. Every instruction mattered when you had less than 2 MHz of processing power and only 8 kilobytes of program space. Nishikado's code exemplified elegant efficiency under severe constraints. The main game loop, the heart of any game, had to accomplish several tasks each frame. It read player input from the control buttons, updated the player's cannon position, managed bullets for both player and aliens, updated alien positions, checked for collisions, updated the score and displayed information, and handled sound output. All of this had to execute within approximately 16.7 milliseconds to maintain 60 frames per second. The order of operations within the loop was carefully considered to ensure responsive controls and smooth visual updates. Sprite rendering was accomplished through bitmap copying. Each graphical element, aliens, the player's cannon, bullets, explosions, and text characters, was stored in ROM as a series of bytes representing pixel patterns. When the game needed to draw an alien, it would calculate the appropriate location in video RAM, then copy the bitmap bytes from ROM to that location. This direct memory manipulation meant graphics updates were as fast as possible, limited only by memory access speed, rather than any intermediate processing. The alien sprites themselves were cleverly designed to minimize memory usage. Each alien type had 2 frames of animation, creating a simple flapping or pulsing effect. These frames were small, perhaps 8 by 8 pixels or similar, requiring only a few bytes per frame. The code would alternate between frames during the alien march, synchronized with the sound effects to create audio-visual harmony. This animation technique, while simple, gave the aliens personality and made them feel alive rather than static. Collision detection was a critical challenge. The game needed to check if player bullets hit aliens, if alien bullets hit the player, if bullets struck barriers, and if aliens reached the bottom of the screen. With dozens of objects potentially interacting, naive collision checking could consume enormous processing time. Nishikado employed spatial optimizations. Instead of checking every object against every other object, the code would first determine which objects were in proximity, then check only those pairs. This reduced the number of comparisons dramatically. For bullet-to-alien collision, the code likely used a technique of checking pixel values directly. When a bullet reached an alien's vertical position, the code would examine the pixels at the bullet's location. If those pixels were part of an alien sprite rather than empty background, a hit was registered. This pixel-perfect collision detection was simpler to implement than more sophisticated geometric approaches and perfectly accurate for the game's needs. The same technique worked for bullets hitting barriers, where the code would simply clear the pixels the bullet intersected, creating the erosion effect. The scoring system was stored in binary-coded decimal (BCD) format, a common technique in early computing when decimal display was important. In BCD, each decimal digit is represented by 4 bits, allowing easy conversion between binary values and decimal displays. When the player destroyed an alien worth 30 points, the code would add 30 in BCD to the current score, handle any carrying between digits, and update the display. This approach simplified the score display code at the cost of slightly more complex arithmetic operations. Sound generation was particularly elegant in its simplicity. The Intel 8080 had output ports that could be toggled on and off. By toggling an output port at a specific frequency, the code could generate a tone. The 4-note bass line was created by cycling through 4 different toggle rates, each corresponding to a musical note. The tempo of the bass line was tied to the main game loop speed, which is why the music accelerated as aliens were destroyed, Fewer aliens meant more loop iterations per second, which meant faster note progression. The alien formation management was efficiently implemented through a data structure that tracked the state of each alien. Based on what we can infer from the game's behavior, each alien likely had a status byte indicating whether it was alive or destroyed, and its position was calculated from its index in the formation, plus the formation's current offset. Rather than storing individual coordinates for each alien, the code stored the formation's position and direction, then calculated individual alien positions mathematically. This saved memory and simplified updates. Changing the formation's position updated all aliens simultaneously. The dropping and reversing logic for the alien formation required careful handling. The formation would move horizontally until reaching a screen boundary, then drop down and reverse direction. The code needed to detect edge collision for the entire formation, not individual aliens. This was accomplished by tracking the leftmost and rightmost living aliens and checking only those against screen boundaries. When a boundary was reached, the formation's direction flag would flip, the vertical position would increment, and movement would continue in the opposite direction. The random elements in the game, alien fire patterns, UFO appearance timing, were generated through pseudo-random number generation. True randomness requires specialized hardware, which arcade machines generally lacked. Instead, the code used a deterministic algorithm that produced sequences of numbers that appeared random. The algorithm would be seeded by timing information, such as the number of frames elapsed since power on, making the sequence different each play session. This pseudo-randomness was sufficient for gameplay purposes while being simple to implement in limited code space. The UFO bonus scoring system, as mentioned earlier, was not actually random but deterministic based on the player's shot count. The code tracked the number of shots fired during the current wave and used that count to index into a table of possible UFO scores. This created the illusion of randomness while actually being predictable for players who understood the system. Expert players learned the shot counts required for maximum UFO bonuses and adjusted their firing patterns accordingly, adding depth for advanced play. Memory management was critical throughout the codebase. With only 1 kilobyte of RAM, every byte had to be justified. Variables were reused wherever possible. Temporary calculations were performed in processor registers rather than memory when feasible. Data structures were packed tightly, sometimes using individual bits as flags rather than full bytes. The stack, used for function calls and temporary storage, was kept small and carefully managed to prevent overflow. This disciplined memory management was essential to fitting the entire game state into available RAM. The initialization code, which ran when the game powered on or reset, had to set up the initial game state, clear video memory, initialize the alien formation, position the player cannon, set starting lives and score, and initialize any variables and flags. This code was executed only once per game, so it could be less optimized than the main loop. The initialization sequence would typically end by transferring control to the main game loop, which would run continuously until game over. The attract mode that ran when no one was playing served multiple purposes. It demonstrated gameplay to potential players, preserved the monitor by varying displayed content, and displayed the high score to entice competitive players. The attract mode code was a simplified version of the gameplay code, running automatically without player input. Some versions of Space Invaders included demonstrations of strategy or showed AI-controlled play, helping teach new players how to succeed. Code optimization was constant throughout development. Assembly language allows precise control over processor operations, and expert programmers can often find ways to accomplish the same task with fewer instructions or faster execution. Nishikado would have optimized critical code paths, the parts of the code that executed most frequently, to squeeze out every available cycle of performance. This might include techniques like loop unrolling, executing multiple iterations explicitly rather than using a loop, using registers instead of memory for frequently accessed values, or exploiting processor quirks for faster operations. The game's code was remarkably robust for its era. It had to handle edge cases. What happens if the player shoots the last alien just as it's about to reach the bottom? What if multiple collisions occur simultaneously? How does the game prevent the player from firing too rapidly? These scenarios required careful consideration and testing to ensure the game didn't crash or behave unexpectedly. The polish evident in the final game suggests extensive playtesting and debugging, a significant achievement when debugging tools were primitive compared to modern standards. Understanding this code-level implementation highlights why Space Invaders was such a significant technical achievement. Modern games are built using high-level languages, sophisticated engines, and powerful hardware that can compensate for inefficient code. Space Invaders had none of these luxuries. Every feature required careful planning, efficient implementation, and constant awareness of hardware limitations. The fact that the resulting game was not only functional but enjoyable and influential speaks to Nishikado's brilliance as both programmer and designer. Space Invaders pioneered the concept of competitive gaming through its high score system, creating a culture of achievement and rivalry that would define arcade gaming throughout the early 1980s. The simple innovation of displaying the highest score achieved on a machine, persistent across play sessions, transformed the game from solitary entertainment into competitive sport. Players didn't just play against the game, they played against every previous player, competing with strangers across time for the crown of arcade champion. The high score was displayed prominently at the top of the screen during gameplay, a constant reminder of the target to beat. When you achieved a new high score, the game would acknowledge your accomplishment, sometimes with a brief fanfare or special display. Your score would then remain on the machine until someone surpassed it, visible to all subsequent players. This created a form of asynchronous multiplayer competition decades before online gaming made such competition commonplace. Arcade operators quickly recognized the competitive appeal and began organizing local tournaments. These events would draw crowds of players competing for prizes, prestige, or simply bragging rights. Tournament formats varied. Some were elimination style, where players competed head-to-head with the lowest score knocked out each round. Others were endurance competitions, testing who could survive the longest on a single credit. Still others were higher score competitions within a time limit, rewarding both skill and efficiency. The social dynamics of these tournaments were fascinating. Players would gather to watch skilled competitors perform, learning techniques and strategies by observation. Successful players developed reputations, becoming local celebrities within their arcade communities. Some developed signature styles, aggressive players who cleared aliens quickly to maximize the speed bonus, defensive players who preserved barriers and played conservatively, or specialized players who focused on timing UFO shots perfectly for maximum bonus points. Strategy guides began appearing in gaming magazines and player-created documents. These guides would detail optimal firing patterns, barrier preservation techniques, and alien target prioritization. Some strategies were mathematical, calculating the exact firing rhythm needed to hit as many aliens as possible before they dropped. Others were psychological, discussing how to manage stress during the frenetic late-wave gameplay when the final aliens zipped across the screen at blinding speed. One particularly famous strategy involved the safe spot, a position on the screen where, under specific circumstances, alien bullets would never reach. Players who mastered this technique could theoretically play indefinitely, limited only by fatigue or machine malfunction. However, exploiting the safe spot was often considered poor sportsmanship in competitive play, and many tournaments explicitly banned its use. The existence of such exploits demonstrated both the depth of player exploration and the unintended consequences of deterministic game systems. Record-keeping became serious business for competitive players. Twin Galaxies, the organization founded in 1981 to track video game world records, began maintaining official high-score listings for Space Invaders and other arcade games. To have your score recognized by Twin Galaxies required playing under specific conditions with witnesses or video documentation. This official record-keeping legitimized competitive gaming and provided objective measures of achievement across different locations. The highest documented Space Invaders scores reached astronomical numbers. In the early 1980s, achieving 100,000 points was considered a remarkable accomplishment. As strategies improved and players devoted thousands of hours to mastering the game, scores climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Marathon sessions would last for hours, testing not just reflexes and strategy, but physical endurance and mental stamina. Some players developed techniques for staying alert during extended play. Specific breathing patterns, eye movement exercises, and methods for maintaining concentration through repetition. The competitive scene also revealed the game's hidden depth. What appeared to be a simple shooting game actually contained layers of optimization. The UFO scoring system's dependence on shot count meant that expert players carefully managed their firing to guarantee maximum bonuses. The alien targeting logic could be manipulated. Experienced players learned which positions were most likely to draw fire and avoided them. Even the timing of alien destruction within a wave affected score multipliers and next wave difficulty, creating opportunities for strategic planning. Different regional scenes developed distinct competitive cultures. Japanese competitive play often emphasized precision and efficiency, with players developing highly optimized patterns that they would execute with near-perfect consistency. American competitive play tended to value adaptability and improvisation, with players showing off their ability to recover from mistakes or handle unexpected situations. European competitive scenes varied by country but often balanced both approaches, creating diverse competitive metagames. The advent of home versions changed competitive play dynamics. While arcade tournaments remained the pinnacle of competitive Space Invaders, home versions allowed players to practice extensively without feeding quarters into machines. This democratized competition to some degree. Players without easy arcade access could still develop skills and compete through score documentation. It also meant that by the time skilled players reached arcades for tournaments, they arrived with thousands of practice games behind them, raising the overall competition level. Some players began treating Space Invaders as a serious skill pursuit, approaching it with the dedication athletes bring to sports. They would practice specific scenarios repeatedly, training muscle memory for common situations. They'd study recordings of top players, analyzing techniques frame by frame. They'd experiment with different physical approaches, standing versus sitting, different hand positions, various methods for reducing input lag between decision and button press. This serious approach to skill development foreshadowed the modern esports mindset. The psychological aspects of competitive play became topics of discussion. How did players manage anxiety during high-stakes games? What mental techniques helped maintain focus during hour-long sessions? How did players cope with the frustration of losing at the end of a long run? Sports psychologists would later study competitive gamers, but even in the early 1980s, serious Space Invaders players were developing informal mental training techniques. The high-score culture surrounding Space Invaders also revealed darker aspects of competition. Cheating emerged as a problem, with some players using techniques to fool arcade operators or referees. Methods included subtle sabotage of rival players' games, manipulation of machine settings to make games easier, or even false documentation of scores. Tournament organizers had to develop verification procedures and anti-cheating measures, laying groundwork for competitive gaming integrity standards that would become more important as prize pools increased. Women in competitive Space Invaders faced challenges reflecting broader societal issues. While the game itself was played by people of all genders, competitive scenes were often male-dominated, and female players sometimes encountered skepticism or hostility. Despite these barriers, skilled female players achieved high rankings and helped demonstrate that gaming excellence was independent of gender. Their participation challenged stereotypes and contributed to slowly evolving attitudes about who could be a gamer. The tournament scene began declining in the mid-1980s as newer games captured player attention and arcade culture evolved. Space Invaders remained popular, but it was no longer the dominant competitive title. However, the infrastructure created for Space Invaders competition, tournament formats, score tracking systems, strategy documentation, community building, transferred to subsequent games. Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and later arcade titles inherited and built upon the competitive framework Space Invaders established. In modern times, Space Invaders has found new life in retro gaming communities and speedrunning. Contemporary players approach the game with sophisticated analytical tools unavailable in the 1970s and 1980s. Frame-by-frame video analysis, computer simulations of optimal play, detailed mapping of game mechanics. This modern analysis has uncovered aspects of the game that even expert players in its heyday didn't fully understand, revealing additional layers of depth in what appeared to be a fully explored game. Speedrunning Space Invaders involves completing specific objectives, clearing a certain number of waves, reaching a target score as quickly as possible. This differs from traditional high-score competition, instead emphasizing efficiency and execution speed. Speedrunners have developed routes and techniques that minimize time per wave, creating a different skill set than marathon high-score play. The speedrunning community's collaborative approach to strategy development, sharing discoveries, improving routes collectively, contrasts with the more secretive, competitive scene of the 1980s. Space Invaders' impact on video game design cannot be overstated. Nearly every game design principle it pioneered or popularized became standard practice, shaping how games were conceived, developed, and experienced for decades afterward. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the specific mechanics Space Invaders introduced and the broader design philosophy it represented. The concept of progressive difficulty, where games become harder as players advance, was perfected in Space Invaders. While earlier games had some difficulty variation, Space Invaders made escalation central to the experience. Each wave presented a greater challenge than the last, ensuring players always operated near the edge of their abilities. This kept games engaging regardless of skill level. Beginners found early waves accessible while experts were challenged by later stages. Modern games, from puzzle games to first-person shooters, employ progressive difficulty inspired by Space Invaders' approach. The wave-based structure became a template for countless games. Clearing all enemies spawns a new wave, slightly harder than the last, creating natural progression and rhythm. This structure appears in tower defense games, arena shooters, survival games, and many other genres. The satisfaction of completing a wave, the brief moment of relief before the next challenge, creates emotional pacing that keeps players engaged. Even games that don't use literal waves often implement similar milestone-based progression. Enemy variety with different behaviors and values was another innovation that became standard. Space Invaders' 3 alien types, each worth different points, created strategic decision-making about target prioritization. This concept expanded in later games to include enemies with different movement patterns, attack styles, and vulnerabilities. The principle that variety creates depth, that multiple enemy types are more interesting than a single enemy type, even if the total number of enemies remains the same, became fundamental to action game design. The destructible cover mechanic, embodied in Space Invaders' eroding barriers, introduced environmental degradation as gameplay element. The barriers weren't just static obstacles, they changed dynamically based on player and enemy actions, creating evolving tactical situations. This concept influenced cover-based shooters, destructible environments in strategy games, and numerous other applications. The idea that the playfield itself could be a dynamic, changeable element rather than a static backdrop opened new design possibilities. Space Invaders demonstrated the power of constrained design space. The entire game took place on a single screen with simple rules and limited verbs: move left, move right, shoot. Yet within these constraints emerged deep, compelling gameplay. This lesson, that constraints can enable focus and creativity rather than limiting them, has been rediscovered by indie developers working with limited resources, and by developers deliberately constraining scope to ensure polish. Some of gaming's most celebrated titles succeed through depth, within constraints rather than breadth across systems. The game established visual clarity as a design priority. Every element on screen was immediately readable. You could tell aliens from bullets, bullets from barriers, foreground from background. Nothing was ambiguous. This clarity meant players could focus on decision-making and execution, rather than struggling to interpret visual information. Modern game designers still emphasize readability, using color coding, distinct silhouettes, and careful composition to ensure players can understand complex scenes at a glance. Space Invaders proved that clarity enhances rather than diminishes challenge. Sound design integration with gameplay, rather than sound as mere decoration, was pioneered in Space Invaders. The 4-note bass line didn't just accompany the action, it synchronized with it, creating audio-visual unity. The accelerating tempo communicated danger more effectively than any visual indicator could. Modern games extensively use audio cues for gameplay feedback, with entire fields like audio game design and accessibility focused on non-visual information communication. Space Invaders showed that sound could be integral to game feel and player experience. The high score as primary motivator created a progression system that required no external rewards or unlock systems. Players were motivated by internal drive, the desire to improve, to beat personal records, to achieve mastery. This intrinsic motivation proved powerful and lasting. While modern games often layer extrinsic rewards, achievements, unlockables, progression systems onto gameplay, the most compelling games still create strong intrinsic motivation. Space Invaders' pure focus on score as the measure of accomplishment demonstrated that gameplay itself could be reward enough. The game's influence extended to business models and monetization. The quarter-per-play model, while not invented by Space Invaders, was perfected by it. The game's difficulty curve ensured most plays lasted an appropriate duration, long enough to feel valuable, short enough to encourage replays. This balance between player satisfaction and revenue optimization became the template for arcade game design throughout the 1980s. Modern free-to-play games employ similar principles, balancing player enjoyment with monetization in ways that echo Space Invaders' quarter-per-play model. Space Invaders established video games as legitimate cultural products worthy of serious attention. Before its success, video games were often dismissed as novelties or children's toys. Space Invaders' mainstream appeal, cultural penetration, and undeniable popularity forced critics, media, and institutions to acknowledge games as significant cultural phenomena. This legitimization enabled the growth of gaming press, academic game studies, and cultural recognition that would eventually lead to games being considered alongside film, music, and literature as important media forms. The game's technical innovations influenced how developers approached hardware constraints. Nishikado's creative solutions to limited memory, processing power, and display capabilities demonstrated that brilliant design could overcome technical limitations. This lesson emboldened developers working with modest resources, showing that gameplay innovation mattered more than raw technical specifications. The indie game movement of recent decades, producing critically acclaimed titles on limited budgets, echoes Space Invaders' philosophy of creativity within constraints. The fixed shooter subgenre that Space Invaders created spawned numerous descendants. Galaxian improved upon the formula with moving aliens that dove at the player. Galaga refined it further with tractor beams and bonus challenges. Centipede, while technically a fixed shooter, innovated with multi-directional shooting and segmented enemies. Each of these games built upon Space Invaders' foundation, while adding unique mechanics. The subgenre remained popular throughout the golden age of arcades and continues in modern indie and mobile games. Educational applications of Space Invaders have been significant. The game's simple systems make it ideal for teaching programming concepts. Countless students have created Space Invaders clones as learning projects, gaining understanding of game loops, collision detection, state management, and graphics rendering. Computer science educators frequently use Space Invaders-style games as practical examples when teaching algorithms, data structures, and software architecture. The game's cultural familiarity makes it an accessible reference point for explaining technical concepts to general audiences. The preservation movement for video game history has treated Space Invaders as a cornerstone. Arcade cabinets have been restored and maintained by collectors and institutions. The original ROM code has been archived and studied. Emulators allow the game to run on modern hardware, ensuring future generations can experience it authentically. This preservation work, inspired partly by Space Invaders' historical importance, established practices now applied to preserving entire gaming history. Organizations like the Video Game History Foundation cite Space Invaders as exemplifying why game preservation matters. Modern game designers continue studying Space Invaders for insights into fundamental design principles. The game's elegance, maximum engagement from minimum mechanics, represents an ideal many designers aspire to achieve. In an era where games can be enormous in scope and feature hundreds of systems, Space Invaders reminds designers that sometimes less is more. The game's enduring playability decades after its creation demonstrates that strong core mechanics transcend technological advancement and graphical fidelity. Space Invaders has remained relevant through continuous reimagining and adaptation to new platforms and player expectations. While the original game endures as a playable classic, developers have explored countless ways to update, remix, and reinterpret the formula for contemporary audiences. These modern versions demonstrate both the flexibility of the core concept and the affection players and developers hold for the game. Space Invaders Extreme, released in 2008 for Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable, represented a complete visual and audio overhaul while preserving the core gameplay. The game featured vibrant neon graphics, pulsing electronic music that responded to player actions, and numerous power-ups and bonus stages absent from the original. Despite these additions, the fundamental loop remained: shoot descending aliens, avoid their fire, clear waves to progress. The Extreme series proved that Space Invaders could accommodate modern game design conventions while maintaining its essential character. Space Invaders Infinity Gene, released in 2009 for mobile platforms, took a different approach, using evolution as both theme and mechanic. The game began as a near-exact replica of the original 1978 version, then gradually introduced new features and visual styles as players progressed. Enemies evolved from simple pixelated forms into complex geometric shapes. Gameplay evolved from basic shooting to include new weapons, movement patterns, and challenges. The evolution concept cleverly tied the game's history to its progression system, making the journey from classic to modern an explicit part of the experience. Modern mobile versions of Space Invaders have adapted the gameplay for touch controls, demonstrating the flexibility of the core design. Touch interfaces lack the precise tactile feedback of arcade buttons, but developers found ways to make the game work. Virtual buttons, swipe controls for movement, tap anywhere to shoot schemes. The core challenge translated successfully despite the input method change, showing that Space Invaders' appeal transcends specific control schemes. Virtual reality implementations of Space Invaders have explored three-dimensional interpretations of the flat original. In VR, players might find themselves surrounded by aliens in 360-degree space, or viewing the classic 2D battlefield from new perspectives within a virtual arcade. These experiments demonstrate how even strongly two-dimensional games can find new life in three-dimensional spaces when designers thoughtfully adapt rather than directly port. Augmented reality versions have brought Space Invaders into the real world, overlaying the game onto physical environments through smartphone cameras or AR glasses. These implementations play with the contrast between the game's digital origins and physical reality, creating uncanny moments as pixelated aliens march across your kitchen or office. The AR format highlights the game's iconic imagery. Those alien sprites are so recognizable that seeing them imposed on reality creates immediate connection to the game's legacy. Crossover appearances in other games have kept Space Invaders in the public consciousness. The alien sprites have appeared as Easter eggs, unlockable content, or references in countless other games. Some games include playable Space Invaders machines within their worlds. Others reference the aliens in character design or level layouts. These appearances function as nods to gaming history, acknowledging Space Invaders' foundational status and assuming player familiarity with its imagery. Educational versions of Space Invaders have been created for teaching various subjects. Math-focused versions might require solving arithmetic problems to shoot aliens. Language learning versions might display vocabulary words on aliens that must be matched with translations. Programming tutorials use Space Invaders clones as projects that teach coding concepts. These educational applications leverage the game's familiarity and inherent engagement to make learning more palatable. Art installations and experimental games have deconstructed and reimagined Space Invaders in provocative ways. Artists have created installations where player actions have real-world consequences, exploring themes of violence and responsibility. Experimental developers have made versions where you play as the aliens, inverting the perspective. Others have removed all visuals, creating audio-only versions that challenge assumptions about what makes the game playable. These avant-garde interpretations demonstrate the game's cultural significance. It's familiar enough that subverting it carries meaning. The speedrunning community has embraced Space Invaders, developing optimized routes and techniques for various objectives. Speedrunners compete to clear specific numbers of waves in minimum time, requiring frame-perfect inputs and deep understanding of the game's systems. Tool-assisted speedruns push the game to theoretical limits, showing what perfect play would look like. These speedrunning efforts reveal details about the game's code and mechanics that weren't fully understood even by expert players in the game's heyday. Competitive Space Invaders has found new life in retro gaming tournaments and events. Classic gaming festivals often feature Space Invaders competitions, bringing together players across generations. Younger players discover the game through these events, while older players reconnect with a formative experience. The game's simple to understand but hard to master nature makes it ideal for spectator-friendly competition. Anyone can understand what's happening, but appreciating expert play requires recognizing the subtle strategies and consistent execution. The game appears frequently in retrospective discussions about gaming history. Documentaries about video games inevitably dedicate significant time to Space Invaders, recognizing its role in transforming games from novelty to industry. Academic papers analyzing game design principles often use Space Invaders as a case study. Designers giving talks about their creative process frequently reference Space Invaders as an example of elegant design. This ongoing discussion keeps the game relevant in professional and academic gaming discourse. Space Invaders merchandise continues being produced, demonstrating sustained commercial appeal. T-shirts, posters, toys, and collectibles featuring the alien sprites remain popular. Limited edition collaborations with fashion brands create high-end products inspired by the game. This merchandising success indicates that Space Invaders has transcended its origins as a game to become a brand and cultural symbol with value, independent of the playable experience. The original arcade cabinets have become valuable collectibles, with restored machines selling for substantial sums to collectors and enthusiasts. The physical cabinets, with their distinctive artwork and period-appropriate design, represent both gaming history and 1970s design aesthetics. Collectors prize working original units, but even non-functional cabinets have value as display pieces and cultural artifacts. This collector market ensures that physical examples of Space Invaders hardware will be preserved for future generations. Ultimately, Space Invaders' continued relevance stems from the strength of its core design. The fundamental loop remains engaging. Shoot aliens, avoid fire, clear waves, improve your score. This loop doesn't require cutting-edge graphics or complex mechanics to be satisfying. It works as well on a smartphone as it did on a dedicated arcade cabinet. The game's simplicity means it's never obsolete. You can always play Space Invaders and experience the essential appeal that captivated millions in 1978. As we reach the end of this journey through Space Invaders history, it's worth reflecting on why this particular game, among thousands released in the late 1970s, became such a defining cultural and technical achievement. The answer lies not in any single innovation, but in the convergence of excellent design, perfect timing, and the vision of Tomohiro Nishikado. Space Invaders appeared at a moment when video games were transitioning from novelty to industry. It demonstrated that games could be more than simple diversions. They could be engaging challenges that rewarded skill and practice. It showed that games could cross demographic boundaries, appealing to diverse audiences. It proved that games could be culturally significant, generating the kind of passion and discussion previously reserved for traditional entertainment media. The technical achievement deserves recognition. Nishikado created a sophisticated game on hardware that was primitive even by 1978 standards. Every feature, the accelerating aliens, the destructible barriers, the synchronized audio-visual experience, required clever programming and efficient implementation. Modern developers working with powerful game engines and gigabytes of RAM can only imagine the constraints Nishikado navigated. His work stands as testament to the power of creativity within limitations. The game's influence on subsequent titles is immeasurable. Countless games adopted Space Invaders' design principles, from wave-based progression to high-score competition to escalating difficulty. The fixed shooter genre it created spawned numerous classics. The broader lessons about clear communication, tight controls, and focused design have informed game development across all genres. Every designer who has studied what makes games compelling has encountered Space Invaders' elegant solutions to fundamental design challenges. Culturally, Space Invaders helped establish video games as legitimate entertainment. It brought games into mainstream consciousness, making them topics of conversation in homes, workplaces, and media outlets. The iconic alien sprites became symbols of the digital age, recognized even by those who never played the game. This cultural penetration paved the way for gaming's evolution from niche hobby to dominant entertainment form. The social spaces that formed around Space Invaders, arcades as gathering places, high-score competition creating community, shared strategies building connections, foreshadowed modern gaming culture. The friendships formed over Space Invaders cabinets, the rivalries over high scores, the collective problem-solving around optimal strategies. All of this anticipates contemporary gaming communities, whether local or online. The basic human desire to share gaming experiences and compete in friendly ways transcends technological era. Looking at Space Invaders today, one sees both a historical artifact and a living game. As an artifact, it represents a specific moment in technological and cultural history, capturing the aesthetics, capabilities, and attitudes of late 1970s Japan and the world. As a living game, it remains playable and engaging, still capable of entertaining and challenging players decades after its creation. This dual nature, historical document and timeless entertainment, ensures Space Invaders' lasting importance. For those who played Space Invaders in its heyday, the game holds nostalgia, representing youth, innocence, and the excitement of discovering video games for the first time. For younger players encountering it through ports or emulation, it offers connection to gaming history and appreciation for foundational design. For developers, it provides lessons in elegant simplicity and the power of constraints. For everyone, it stands as proof that brilliant ideas, skillfully executed, can resonate across generations. The story of Space Invaders is ultimately about innovation arising from constraints, about artistic vision meeting technical reality, and about how simple systems can create profound engagement. It's about a game that changed the world not through complexity or spectacle, but through understanding what makes interactive entertainment compelling at its core. The aliens may be simple pixelated sprites, but they represent something larger. The birth of modern gaming, the power of design, and the universality of play. So as we close this exploration of Space Invaders' complete history, take a moment to appreciate what this game represents. When you see those familiar alien sprites on a t-shirt, in a museum, in a modern game as an Easter egg, remember the journey we've traced tonight. Remember Tomohiro Nishikado working alone to bring his vision to life. Remember the Japanese players who made the game a sensation. Remember the American arcades transformed by its arrival. Remember the technical wizardry hidden in assembly code. Remember the communities formed around high scores. Remember the lasting influence on all games that followed. Space Invaders isn't just a game from 1978. It's a foundational moment in digital entertainment history, a technical marvel, a cultural phenomenon, and a timeless piece of interactive design. The aliens descended onto our screens, and nothing was ever quite the same. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can hear that 4-note bass line one more time, quickening its tempo, building tension, reminding you that sometimes the simplest ideas, executed brilliantly, are the ones that endure forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete history of Space Invaders. If you enjoyed this exploration, I invite you to like and subscribe, or to share your own Space Invaders memories in the comments below. Rest now, and let your dreams be filled with glowing screens, descending formations, and the quiet satisfaction of a perfect shot. Good night.